Have you ever paused in the middle of your busy day and felt a quiet whisper deep inside, asking, "Am I truly at peace?" In a world that moves faster with every passing second, where notifications pull at your attention and responsibilities weigh like invisible chains, it's easy to forget the most precious possession we carry, a relaxed soul. Think about it for a moment. Money can come and go. Achievements can fade into memory. Even relationships, as beautiful as they are, cannot shield us from the restless chatter of our own minds. But a soul that is truly calm, a mind at ease, that is a treasure no one can steal. Across centuries, sages, monks, and ordinary seekers alike have whispered the same truth. Peace is not something you find outside. It cannot be bought or earned through titles, fame, or possessions. It arises quietly from within when we learn to let go, when we learn to breathe into the tension of life rather than resist it. Imagine standing on a quiet mountain at dawn. The mist wraps around you, the first rays of sunlight kiss the peaks, and the air feels impossibly light. You breathe in, and for the first time in a long while, you notice the stillness inside you. That stillness, that soft, unshakable calm, is more valuable than all the treasures of the world combined. It is the essence of what it means to live fully, deeply, and meaningfully. Yet, how often do we overlook it? How often do we chase the next email, the next appointment, the next distraction, while the one treasure that could sustain us slips quietly through our grasp? This is the paradox of modern life. We are surrounded by abundance, yet scarcity lives in our hearts. And it is scarcity of peace, not of wealth or opportunity, that leaves the deepest ache. But here is the secret. Cultivating a relaxed soul is not some unattainable ideal. It is not reserved for monks cloistered in remote temples or for those with endless hours to meditate. Even amidst chaos, even in the heart of our daily struggles, we can discover this hidden treasure. The key is learning how to pause, how to release, and how to listen, not just with our ears but with our hearts. In the journey ahead, we will explore the weight that burdens us, the wisdom that can guide us, and the practices that have stood the test of time. We will see how letting go, being mindful, embracing simplicity, and opening our hearts can gently unravel the knots of tension and fear. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the treasure that has been within us all along begins to shine. So, take a deep breath. Allow yourself this moment to simply be. This is the beginning of a journey, not to somewhere far away, but inward, toward the quiet, priceless sanctuary of your own soul. Have you ever noticed how heavy life can feel, even when everything seems fine on the surface? The burden is often invisible. It's not a stack of bills, a looming deadline, or a harsh word from someone else. It's the quiet tension that sits in your chest, the restlessness that whispers in the corners of your mind. This is the weight we carry, the invisible load that keeps our souls from relaxing. Stress is subtle. It creeps in through the back door of our daily routines. Perhaps it's the endless scroll of social media, where other people's successes cast shadows over our own lives. Or maybe it's the relentless voice in your head reminding you of everything you haven't done, everything you might fail at, everything you fear. Over time, these small pressures accumulate like stones in a backpack, until suddenly the weight feels unbearable. And then there's agitation, the inner storm that comes when we resist what is, when we cling to what should be, or when we allow expectations to rule our hearts. It shows up as impatience, irritation, anxiety, or that nagging sense that life is somehow not enough. We chase the next accomplishment, the next recognition, the next moment of relief, thinking that once we reach it, the burden will lift. But often it doesn't. It just shifts to the next challenge, the next worry, the next unspoken fear. Consider a story of a man who seemed to have it all: career, family, possessions, but carried a constant tension in his chest. Each day he rose early, rushed to work, navigated endless tasks, and went to bed exhausted yet restless. One evening, standing on a quiet street, he watched a small child laugh without concern, completely present in the moment. And for a fleeting second, he realized something he had forgotten. The weight he carried was not life itself, but the way he clung to control, the way he feared imperfection, the way he demanded more from himself than anyone else could ask. This is the paradox. The burden is not in the events of life, but in our relationship with them. Our attachments, our fears, our judgments, they are the true stones in our backpack. And while we may not be able to control everything that happens, we can learn to release the pressure we place on ourselves. Philosophers and sages throughout history have pointed to the same insight. Suffering arises not from life itself, but from resistance, attachment, and ignorance of the impermanent nature of our experiences. Buddhism calls this dukkha, the subtle dissatisfaction that shadows even the moments we label as good. Recognizing it is the first step toward freedom. Take a moment now to feel the weight you carry. Perhaps it's a knot of worry in your stomach, a tension in your shoulders, or a racing mind that won't quiet. Acknowledge it without judgment. Naming the weight is not weakness. It is clarity. It is the beginning of understanding how stress and agitation shape the contours of your inner world. Because here's the truth. You are not the weight, and the weight is not you. You are the awareness that notices it. And once we begin to see clearly, once we recognize the stones in our backpack, we can start to learn how to set them down, one by one, moment by moment. And as we begin to understand the load we carry, we open the door to release. The journey from tension to tranquility does not happen in a single leap. It unfolds gradually, like dawn creeping over the horizon, gentle yet unstoppable. And in that unfolding, we discover the first hints of the treasure we glimpsed in the quiet of the mountain air, the relaxed soul that waits patiently within, untouched by chaos, serene even in the storm. There is a gentle whisper in every tradition, every teaching, and every story of those who have walked the path of wisdom. To hold too tightly is to suffer, to release is to live. Yet in the midst of our busy lives, the idea of letting go can feel impossible. Letting go does not mean abandoning responsibility, ignoring life, or escaping from pain. It is the art of freeing ourselves from the chains we forge with our own minds. Imagine holding a stone in your hand. At first, it feels heavy but manageable. Hours pass and the weight presses harder against your palm. Your hand aches, your arm tires. The stone hasn't changed, yet your grasp makes it unbearable. This is the human experience of attachment, holding on to thoughts, fears, memories, and desires that no longer serve us. The more we cling, the heavier our hearts become. Buddhist wisdom teaches us a radical truth. Suffering is born from attachment, from craving what we do not have, from resisting what is, from clinging to what cannot last. It's not life itself that traps us. It is our refusal to release, our insistence that the world must bend to our expectations. But release is not an act of weakness. It is strength cloaked in gentleness. It is the courage to face life fully and instead of gripping tightly, to open our hands and trust the flow of existence. It is the understanding that nothing is permanent, and in that impermanence, there is profound freedom. Consider the story of an old monk, often visited by seekers struggling with loss, fear, or anger. One day, a young disciple approached him, burdened by resentment and grief. The monk asked him to pick up a vase filled with water and hold it above his head. Minutes passed and the disciple's arms ached, sweat forming on his brow. "Why does it hurt so much?" the disciple asked. The monk smiled gently and said, "Because you are holding on. Life asks you only to carry what is needed. Release the rest." And so it is with the mind. Every grudge, every worry, every expectation we clutch tightly adds weight we were never meant to bear. The act of letting go, whether it is forgiving someone, releasing a fear, or simply accepting a moment as it is, lightens the heart in ways that nothing else can. This is not a one-time event but a daily practice. Letting go is like tending a garden. Weeds of resentment and fear sprout constantly, and each day requires awareness, patience, and gentle effort. Meditation, mindfulness, and reflection are the tools we use to identify what we cling to and to consciously release it. In every breath, there is an invitation. Exhale what no longer serves you. Inhale peace. When we let go, a remarkable transformation occurs. The mind unclenches, the heart softens, and suddenly, life is not a burden to endure but a river to flow with. We discover that freedom is not about controlling circumstances, but about choosing not to be controlled by them. The soul relaxes, and in that relaxation, we touch a glimpse of the treasure we've been seeking all along. And yet, letting go does not mean a life without care or a heart without love. On the contrary, it deepens our capacity to engage with the world. When we release attachment, we can love more fully, act more wisely, and respond more skillfully. The world may still bring challenges, but our inner ground remains steady, unshaken by fleeting storms. So take a moment now to notice what you are holding tightly. Perhaps it is a fear of the future, a regret from the past, or a desire that feels never-ending. Place it gently in your awareness, and then, as if setting down a heavy stone, imagine releasing it. Feel the subtle shift as tension unwinds. This is the practice. This is the art of letting go. And in this gentle release, the next step begins to reveal itself. The cultivation of awareness and mindfulness, the next key to sustaining a relaxed soul amidst the constant flow of life. Have you ever felt adrift in your own life? The hours slip by, conversations blur, and tasks pile up, while your mind spins endlessly with thoughts, worries, and what-ifs. It's as though you are living, yet not fully present, your attention scattered like leaves in the wind. This is where mindfulness becomes not just a practice, but a lifeline. Mindfulness is the simple, profound act of paying attention, intentionally, fully, and without judgment, to the present moment. It is noticing the rise and fall of your breath, the gentle sway of your body, the rhythm of your thoughts, and the subtle sensations of being alive. At first, it may seem small, almost trivial, but its power is immense. It is the anchor that steadies the soul amidst the chaos of life. Think of a boat on a turbulent river. Without an anchor, it is tossed by every current, every wave. With an anchor, it remains steady, even as the water roars around it. Mindfulness is that anchor. It does not stop the challenges of life, nor does it erase discomfort, but it allows you to meet each moment with clarity, composure, and a sense of grounded presence. In Buddhist practice, mindfulness, sati, is not just an abstract concept. It is a tool to awaken the mind to its own nature, to observe thoughts without becoming entangled, to recognize emotions without being overwhelmed. It is the gentle illumination that reveals both the beauty and the impermanence of every experience. Consider a person rushing through a morning routine, brushing teeth, scrolling messages, making breakfast, all on autopilot. Now imagine they pause to feel the warmth of water on their hands, to notice the scent of coffee, to breathe deeply and hear the rhythm of their own heartbeat. That moment of awareness transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary. The mind, once scattered, finds calm. The soul, once restless, finds space to breathe. Mindfulness is not about escaping life or rejecting its challenges. On the contrary, it allows us to engage more fully with everything we encounter. By observing our thoughts and emotions without judgment, we cultivate the ability to respond rather than react, to choose wisdom over impulse, and to create a buffer of peace in the heart that no external turbulence can penetrate. And the effects ripple outward. A mindful person may notice subtle patterns, the tension that arises before a difficult conversation, the way anger tightens the chest, the fleeting moments of joy that often go unrecognized. This awareness becomes a guide, teaching us how to navigate life with presence, grace, and intentionality. Storytelling offers a vivid image. A young woman struggling with anxiety learns to focus on her breath each morning. At first, her mind races and she feels frustrated, but with persistence, she discovers a hidden rhythm within herself. The chaos outside no longer dictates her inner state. She faces challenges with composure, finds clarity in decision-making, and most importantly, experiences moments of deep, unshakable peace. A peace that does not depend on circumstances, but arises naturally from mindful awareness. In essence, mindfulness anchors the soul. It reminds us that even when life is unpredictable, even when storms arise, we are not lost. We are present, aware, capable of observing the currents of thought and emotion without being swept away. This anchoring is the foundation for a relaxed soul, the bedrock upon which tranquility, wisdom, and joy can flourish. And as we deepen our practice, mindfulness begins to reveal another truth. Life's beauty is found in the present, not in regrets of the past or anxieties about the future. Each breath, each sensation, each moment becomes a doorway to freedom, a chance to reconnect with the calm, unshakable core that has always been there. With this awareness, the path forward becomes clear. The next step in cultivating a relaxed soul is embracing simplicity, the art of finding contentment not in accumulation, but in the elegance of enough. In the whirlwind of modern life, it's easy to believe that more is better. More achievements, more possessions, more recognition. Yet paradoxically, the more we chase, the further we drift from true peace. Simplicity and contentment, as ancient wisdom teaches, are not about deprivation. They are about discovering abundance in what already exists. Imagine a life uncluttered, not just in your surroundings, but in your mind and heart. A space where needs are met, desires are understood, and satisfaction flows naturally from within. This is the essence of contentment, recognizing that happiness does not come from accumulation, but from acceptance. It is the quiet joy of knowing that enough is already present. Buddhist teachings often point to simplicity as a path to liberation. The Buddha himself renounced the trappings of royalty, choosing instead a life that focused on the essentials: ethical living, mindful awareness, and the cultivation of inner peace. His life was not about deprivation, it was about clarity. With less clutter, both external and internal, the mind is free to see deeply, to breathe fully, and to experience the profound treasures that life offers in every moment. Consider the story of a man overwhelmed by his possessions, always striving to acquire more, thinking each new object would bring satisfaction. Yet, every addition brought complexity, responsibility, and more anxiety. One day he observed a child playing joyfully with a simple stick, creating endless worlds from nothing. The man realized that true richness was not in what he owned, but in how fully he could engage with the present moment. He began to simplify, not only his environment, but his thoughts and expectations. Slowly, a deep sense of ease settled in. Contentment does not require ignoring challenges or pretending everything is perfect. It is a shift in perspective, seeing life as it is, appreciating the small gifts, and letting go of the endless hunger for more. Simplicity clears the mental clutter, leaving room for mindfulness, gratitude, and a profound connection to what truly matters. The power of enough transforms every aspect of life. In relationships, it allows us to cherish presence over perfection. In work, it enables focus and creativity rather than burnout. In our inner world, it nurtures a calm, relaxed soul, unshaken by comparison or desire. Storytelling brings this lesson alive. A young woman, consumed by the need to keep up with others, decided to declutter her home and her schedule. She discovered that when obligations were reduced, she could finally hear the quiet stirrings of her own heart. Simplicity revealed what had been invisible: the joy in a shared meal, the beauty of a quiet morning, the satisfaction of a completed task done with care. With each small act of letting go, her soul relaxed a little more. And simplicity is not only about removing excess, it is about prioritizing what nurtures the soul. Time spent in reflection, in meditation, in meaningful connection with others. These are the treasures that remain when we strip away what is unnecessary. Life becomes lighter, deeper, and infinitely more satisfying. Contentment and simplicity are the companions of mindfulness. They teach us to be present, to appreciate the ordinary, and to recognize the extraordinary hidden in the everyday. In this way, less is truly more. Less striving, less clutter, less attachment, and more freedom, more clarity, more peace. As the heart grows lighter, it naturally opens to a deeper truth. that the soul is nourished not by possessions or status, but by connection, compassion, and love. The next step in this journey is learning how opening our hearts to others not only enriches their lives, but also deepens the tranquility within our own. There is a quiet power in the human heart, a power that awakens when we move beyond ourselves, beyond our worries and desires, and reach toward others with genuine care. Compassion is not merely a feeling, it is a practice, a way of being that softens the boundaries between me and you. And in that softening, the soul finds one of its deepest forms of relaxation. Connection and compassion are like rivers that flow from the heart. They nourish not only those around us but also ourselves. When we act with kindness, when we listen without judgment, when we offer support without expectation, something remarkable happens. The tension within us dissolves. Our hearts lighten and a deep sense of ease spreads through our being. Buddhist wisdom reminds us that suffering is often intertwined with isolation. When we are disconnected, emotionally, socially, spiritually, we carry our burdens alone, and the weight grows heavier. Compassion bridges this gap. It creates a web of empathy, understanding, and shared humanity. By acknowledging the struggles of others and responding with care, we begin to heal our own inner friction. Consider a story. A man, exhausted by life's demands, walked past a homeless woman each morning. At first, he ignored her, lost in his own thoughts. One day, compelled by a quiet voice inside, he offered a simple gesture: coffee, a smile, conversation. The woman's gratitude and warmth sparked something unexpected within him. He felt lighter, calmer, more connected. That small act of compassion released years of tension he hadn't even realized he carried. Connection is not only about grand gestures. It is present in the small moments: holding a door open, listening fully to a friend, sending an encouraging word. Each act of kindness is a thread woven into the fabric of our shared life, and each thread strengthens not just those it touches, but also the quiet sanctuary of peace within ourselves. Compassion also invites us to see life through a wider lens. When we witness suffering, whether in the world or within ourselves, we learn to soften our judgments, to replace irritation with understanding, and to approach challenges with patience. This softening is a balm for the soul, easing the tight grip of fear, anger, and resentment. Opening the heart does not mean abandoning boundaries or ignoring reality. It means embracing life fully, with courage and empathy, while remaining grounded in our own center. A heart that is closed out of fear may feel safe, but it cannot experience the fullness of peace. A heart that opens even a little discovers that the release of tension it brings is incomparable. Storytelling brings this lesson alive. A young woman overwhelmed by anxiety began volunteering at a local shelter. At first, she felt drained, unsure if she could offer anything meaningful. Over time, however, she discovered a surprising truth. By giving care and attention to others, she also cared for herself. The act of connecting, of seeing the humanity in others, created a sanctuary within her own heart, a relaxed, luminous space where worry no longer held sway. Compassion, connection, and kindness are the bridges between a restless mind and a relaxed soul. They transform everyday interactions into opportunities for inner peace. And as the heart opens, it naturally prepares us for moments of stillness, reflection, and introspection, the next steps in cultivating lasting tranquility. Through mindfulness, simplicity, and compassion, the soul learns to breathe freely, unburdened by fear, greed, or isolation. And as we journey further, we encounter a practice that deepens this calm even more. Embracing silence and solitude, the quiet spaces where the heart truly whispers and the soul finds rest. In the noise of everyday life, silence often feels foreign. Our minds are filled with chatter, thoughts racing like a river in flood, tasks competing for attention, worries demanding our focus. Yet in that very silence we resist, the soul finds its greatest refuge. Solitude and silence are not emptiness. They are spaces where clarity, calm, and insight emerge. Imagine stepping into a quiet forest just as the sun begins to rise. The world around you is still, except for the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. In this stillness, you notice something remarkable. Your thoughts begin to settle, your breath deepens, and a sense of inner space unfolds. This is the power of solitude, a sacred pause where the soul can breathe, untangled from the incessant demands of the outside world. Buddhist teachings emphasize the value of retreat, not as isolation for its own sake, but as a way to reconnect with the essence of being. Silence allows the mind to listen, not to the noise of the world, but to the quiet whisper of awareness within. In this space, we can observe our thoughts, our emotions, and our patterns without distraction or judgment. Solitude gives the mind room to rest and the heart room to expand. Consider the story of a young monk new to monastic life. At first, he found the long hours of silence unbearable. His mind rebelled, restless and loud. But gradually, as he embraced these quiet moments, he discovered a profound rhythm within himself. Each silence became a teacher, each solitary breath a guide. In stillness, he encountered the depth of his own being, a calm, unwavering presence that no noise could disturb. Silence and solitude are not just for monks or spiritual seekers. They are gifts available to anyone willing to step away from distraction, even briefly. A quiet morning with a cup of tea, a walk without music, a moment of deep breathing before sleep. These are gateways to the same inner peace that sages have cultivated for centuries. And in this silence, we discover an unexpected truth. The world does not need to be controlled, our minds do not need to be constantly occupied, and our hearts do not need to cling. The very act of allowing quiet to exist, without forcing, judging, or reacting, becomes a practice of liberation. Storytelling brings this lesson alive. A woman, overwhelmed by her career and family obligations, began setting aside 10 minutes each morning just to sit in stillness. At first, her mind resisted, jumping from thought to thought. But over time, these moments of silence became sacred. She noticed the subtle shifts in her energy, the softening of tension in her shoulders, the expansion of patience in her heart. In the quiet, she rediscovered a sanctuary that had always been within her reach. Solitude and silence are mirrors reflecting the true nature of our minds. They reveal not emptiness, but fullness of awareness, of presence, and of possibility. They allow the soul to settle into its natural rhythm, unburdened by distraction, expectation, or fear. And as the heart grows comfortable in this quiet, it naturally becomes ready to face the world with balance. The next step is learning how to integrate this stillness into the flow of everyday life, anchoring calm amid activity, and discovering the art of living with presence even when demands press in. Life, with all its demands, can feel like walking a tightrope. Work pressures, family responsibilities, social obligations, they pull us in countless directions. Yet the soul craves balance, a harmony where action and stillness, effort and ease, outer engagement and inner peace coexist. Integrating mindful practice into daily life is the art that transforms this delicate walk into a dance. The challenge is real. We spend our days reacting, answering emails, meeting deadlines, negotiating conflicts, often unaware that our minds are pulled into patterns of tension and distraction. But what if, amid the busyness, we could carry the calm of meditation, the simplicity of contentment, and the openness of compassion like a quiet companion? What if our inner peace could flow seamlessly into every moment? Integration begins with small, intentional acts. It could be taking a mindful breath before responding to a difficult email, noticing the sensations of water on your hands while washing dishes, or pausing to listen fully when someone speaks. These seemingly ordinary moments become the threads weaving serenity into the fabric of daily life. Buddhist wisdom emphasizes that practice is not separate from life. It is life. Sitting on a cushion for an hour is valuable, but the true test comes when you step off the mat. Every interaction, every challenge, every moment is an opportunity to embody mindfulness, simplicity, and compassion. In this way, inner peace is not confined to quiet retreats. It moves with you, adapts to your world, and transforms it. Consider a story. A young professional, burdened by stress and fatigue, began integrating brief mindfulness exercises into her day. She took a moment to breathe deeply before meetings, walked slowly while commuting, and consciously listened to her colleagues. Over weeks, her sense of balance shifted. She was not free from challenges, but her response to them became steadier. Tension in her body eased, her mind felt clearer, and she discovered a relaxed space within herself that remained, even amid chaos. Balance also requires awareness of limits. Life cannot be mastered through sheer willpower alone. We must honor our need for rest, for reflection, for solitude. Overextending, overcommitting, or neglecting the body and heart only disrupts the equilibrium we seek. Integration is the careful tending of both inner and outer life, ensuring that effort is aligned with ease, action with reflection. Storytelling deepens this insight. A father, consumed by work and ambition, found himself increasingly distant from his family. Guided by mindfulness, he began setting aside uninterrupted time each evening, not out of obligation but as a practice of presence. He noticed the laughter of his children, the quiet appreciation of his partner, and the richness of shared meals. These small, consistent choices created a rhythm that balanced his professional drive with his human need for connection and calm. The beauty of integrated practice lies in its subtlety. It is not dramatic or flashy. It is a series of small, mindful decisions that, over time, accumulate into profound transformation. Mindful breathing before a stressful conversation, gentle pauses during a hectic schedule, acts of kindness without expectation. All of these cultivate a life where the soul remains relaxed, grounded, and responsive rather than reactive. And as we integrate practice into daily life, we naturally encounter another essential truth. Everything in life is impermanent. Challenges arise, situations change, and loss occurs. Recognizing this impermanence allows us to navigate life's fluctuations with grace, letting go when necessary and embracing the flow rather than resisting it. Through integration, the principles of mindfulness, simplicity, compassion, and solitude are no longer isolated practices. They become the rhythm of life itself. The soul begins to move with ease, responsive rather than burdened, anchored yet flexible. And with this harmony, we are prepared to face one of life's most profound lessons, embracing impermanence and releasing attachment. Life is in constant motion. People change, seasons shift, moments come and go, and nothing remains as it once was. Yet so often we clinging to what is familiar, to what comforts us, to what we fear losing. Attachment is the silent thread that binds the heart, creating tension, fear, and suffering. Facing impermanence is the act of gently loosening that thread, discovering freedom within change. Buddhist teachings call this truth anicca, the recognition that everything is transient. Everything we hold dear will eventually change. Our youth, our possessions, our relationships, our achievements, even our thoughts and emotions. This is not a reason for despair. It is an invitation to live more fully, to love more deeply, and to cherish the present moment before it passes. Imagine holding a handful of sand. The tighter you grasp it, the more slips through your fingers. But if you allow your hand to remain open, the sand rests lightly, secure only in its natural flow. Life is much the same. When we release the illusion of permanence and the need to control, we find a weight lifted from the heart. A relaxed soul emerges naturally, unburdened by fear of loss or longing for what cannot stay. Consider a story. A young woman experienced a sudden change in her career, an unexpected job loss that left her feeling destabilized. Initially, panic and resistance consumed her. She clung to expectations of security and status. But gradually, she began to practice mindfulness and reflection, noticing that every situation, no matter how painful, carried a lesson. By embracing impermanence, she discovered a hidden freedom, the ability to adapt, to release fear, and to find new opportunities she had never imagined. Attachment is not limited to external things. We attach to ideas, identities, and outcomes. We cling to the story of who we should be, how life should unfold, and what others should do. Recognizing this, we learn to let go not through force or denial, but through awareness and acceptance. This act of release is not loss, it is liberation. Storytelling illuminates this truth further. A monk once observed a river flowing past his monastery. Every day the water looked the same, yet it was never the same. He likened life to that river, ever-changing, never stagnant. He taught his disciples that peace comes not from stopping the river or holding onto its water, but from learning to float gracefully with its current. In letting go, they discovered the profound relaxation of the soul. Facing impermanence also deepens gratitude. When we understand that moments are fleeting, we become more attentive to their beauty, more present with the people we love, more appreciative of the ordinary gifts that often go unnoticed. Each experience becomes precious precisely because it cannot last forever. And in this awareness, we find courage. Courage to forgive, to release grudges, to accept endings, and to welcome beginnings. Courage to live fully knowing that loss is inevitable, yet life's richness is still available in every moment. The relaxed soul is born in this balance of acceptance and presence, rooted in awareness, free from grasping. As we let go of attachments, we prepare ourselves for the final realization of this journey, understanding the ultimate treasure we have been cultivating all along. A soul at ease, unshaken by impermanence, deeply grounded in the calm, luminous space within. At the heart of every teaching, every practice, every moment of reflection lies a single truth. Nothing is more precious than a relaxed soul. We have journeyed together through the weight we carry, the art of letting go, the anchoring power of mindfulness, the elegance of simplicity, the warmth of compassion, the sanctuary of silence, the balance of daily life, and the embrace of impermanence. Each chapter has been a step toward uncovering this ultimate treasure, and now we arrive at the quiet center of it all. A relaxed soul is not a destination reached by luck, nor a reward earned through struggle. It is the natural state of the heart when the mind is free from clinging, when the breath flows unforced, and when awareness rests fully in the present. It is a calm that persists even in turbulence, a lightness that endures beyond circumstance, a presence that is unshakable. Imagine the simplest moments, watching the sunrise paint the sky, listening to a friend's laughter, feeling the warmth of sunlight on your skin. In a relaxed soul, these moments are magnified. Life's beauty is not something we must chase. It is available in every breath, every gesture, every ordinary encounter. The mind unclenches, the heart softens, and suddenly the world is richer, brighter, and more alive than we ever realized. The journey we have taken together also reveals a profound paradox. The more we release, the more we gain. Letting go of attachment, expectation, and judgment does not leave emptiness. It creates space. Space for presence, for gratitude, for joy. Space for connection, for love, for compassion. Space for the soul to rest in its own natural, luminous state. Storytelling brings this lesson to life. Consider an elder who has lived through decades of change, loss, and triumph. They have learned that the world is impermanent, that possessions fade, that people leave, yet the quiet space within remains untouched. In that space, they move through life with grace, patience, and serenity. Their joy is not dependent on circumstance. It flows from a relaxed soul, cultivated slowly, intentionally, and tenderly over time. And this is the ultimate treasure, a soul that is free, present, and at ease. It is a treasure that no one can take away, that no challenge can diminish, that no passage of time can erode. It is yours, waiting quietly within, accessible through awareness, release, and love. As we close this journey, take a deep breath and feel it fully. Let your shoulders soften, your mind settle, your heart open. Notice the treasure you have carried all along, the capacity to be at peace, to be mindful, to be fully alive. This treasure does not require perfect circumstances. It does not require more possessions, more achievements, or more approval. It asks only for your presence, your awareness, and your willingness to let go. So, as you step back into your day, remember this. The world will continue to demand, to challenge, to surprise, but within you lies a sanctuary, a place of stillness, clarity, and calm, a place where the soul can relax and simply be. This is the ultimate treasure. This is the gift you can carry, unshaken and luminous, through every moment of life. If this message resonated with you and you feel the calm of a relaxed soul beginning to awaken within, I invite you to join our community at Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Subscribe and turn on notifications so that together we can explore more teachings, reflections, and practices that nurture mindfulness, compassion, and inner peace. Every video is an opportunity to pause, breathe, and reconnect with the quiet, luminous space inside you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your insights and experiences can inspire others on their journey. Remember, the most precious treasure is always within. Let us walk this path together, one mindful step at a time.